knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. You came by grind, came by ambition. It was pain, not love, writing in the kitchen. Most gonna hear what I'm saying, but who's gonna listen? I use music as a way of life. It's more than words I deliver on the mic. What's the details? If no CDs, what's your email? Living missions from first listen. You knew this was different. Knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. You came by vision, eyes focus on roads is bumpy. We call mistakes potholes. Riches being healthy, time balance with a good soul. Where's my time gone? I'm in the zone, not figured out. Peso bets ever took a harder route. Truth to talk about, but why lie? I survive off myself. CD burner in the sky is my help and nothing else. And knowledge ain't free. And knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. And knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention. Knowledge ain't free, gotta pay attention.
Hey everyone, today we're diving into a huge topic that's super relevant and often misunderstood, the history of color prejudice. It's actually way older and more complex than you might think. To really get into this, we're pulling insights from the author J.A. Rodgers' classic book, Nature Knows No Color Line. Stick around as we explore how ideas around skin color, social status, and prejudice developed over time. And if this piques your interest, check out more on the Fire Talk Radio podcast. The Forward. The Forward of Nature Knows No Color Line by J.A. Rodgers presents a powerful argument against the concept of racial purity and the artificial divisions created by skin color. Rodgers challenges the idea of pure races by tracing racial intermixing throughout history, particularly between so-called Caucasian and Negro populations. He discusses how physical variations like skin color, facial structure, and hair type are merely adaptations to climate over time, emphasizing that humanity is fundamentally united beyond these superficial traits. The Forward also argues that color prejudice is not inherent but socially constructed, often used by those in power as means of control. Rodgers highlights numerous historical examples and references influential thinkers from Socrates to Shakespeare who recognized the essential unity of humanity. Rodgers' intent is to dispel the myth of racial purity using a wide range of historical and anthropological sources to demonstrate that humanity has always been interconnected. He closes by acknowledging that his findings may offend some, but asserts that truth and acceptance of diversity are paths toward enlightenment and understanding. So let's take a look at the esteemed J.A. Rodgers, the author. Joel Augustus Rodgers, commonly known as J.A. Rodgers, was a prominent Jamaican-American historian, author, and journalist dedicated to exploring African contributions to world history. Born in 1880 in Jamaica, Rodgers migrated to the United States as a young man and eventually gained prominence for his pioneering research into the African ancestry of notable figures in Western history, highlighting a shared, interconnected heritage across races. Largely self-taught, he dedicated his life to challenging misconceptions about race and race-based hierarchies by compiling a wide range of evidence from both historical and contemporary sources. Rodgers is best known for his work such as Nature Knows No Color Line, Sex and Race, and World's Great Men of Color, which collectively debunked myths surrounding racial purity and promoted the idea of racial unity. His research was groundbreaking, meticulously documenting mixed race lineages of European royalty, significant historical figures, and even American political leaders, challenging notions of racial superiority and segregation. By presenting this evidence, Rodgers made a lasting impact on African American scholarship and civil rights, drawing praise from influential leaders, including W.E.B. Du Bois. So that's a brief rundown on the esteemed researcher and author J.A. Rodgers. And we're going to go into his book today, Nature Knows No Color Line, to see what it is that he documented as some of the earliest recordings of where color prejudice may have originated. So, the first point, history of prejudice origins in India. So, where did color prejudice actually start? One of the earliest records that J.A. Rodgers documents can be traced to the distant past in ancient India. When the lighter-skinned Aryans invaded the Indus Valley, they encountered the darker-skinned Daisas, and the caste system based on skin color was born. This is what's stated in Chapter 1, page 7 through 8 of Nature Knows No Color Line. And I quote, "The first recorded instance of color prejudice I have been able to find is in India of some 5,000 years ago when the Aryas, or Aryans, invaded the valley of the Indus and found there are a black people, the Daisas, or Daisas. In any case, we find very clear evidences of it in Aryan writings. In the Rig Veda, Book 9, Hymn 42, verse 1, Indra, their national god is depicted as blowing away with supernatural might from earth and from the heavens the black skin which Indra hates. Hymn 42 and verse 1 tells of driving the black skin far away. The blacks were called Anasas, noseless people. Book 5, Hymn 29 and 10 tells how Indra slew the flat-nosed barbarians on page 7. India's caste system was based on color. The word Varna, caste, literally means color. Arya Varna, which means white skin, Krishna Varna, black skin. The Aryans of India, says the Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, prided themselves on their fairer skins and more Aguilian features and held in derision the black color and flatter physiognomies of the Aborigines, regarded them much as conquering whites regarded blacks in Africa. This shows to some degree that skin tone became a marker of social hierarchy. If you're enjoying this podcast presentation, please hit the subscribe button. It only takes a couple seconds to do so, and we would really appreciate it if you did. Also, like and share this content to your friends, family, and associates. Point number 2, history of prejudice origins within Egypt. But India isn't the only place where color became a factor. Ancient Egypt had its own version of this, although it wasn't as severe. This is off of the pages of Nature Knows No Color Line, pages 8 through 9. And I quote, "The next evidence of it I have been able to find is in ancient Egypt. Gerald Massey, perhaps the greatest of all authorities on ancient Egyptian lore, said, on the monuments, the dark people are commonly called the evil race of Kush. But when the Ethiopian element dominates the dark people, retort by calling the light complexions the pale, degraded race of Arvad. But this prejudice of fair for dark and the converse was, it is safe to say, never nearly as strong as in India. The whites did not come in any considerable number to Egypt until the Ptolemaic invasion of the 3rd century BC, by which time intermixture had already taken to a firm root for any appreciable degree of color prejudice. The lighter-skinned Egyptians was sometimes called darker-skinned people the evil race of Rush. But here's the thing, in Egypt, color prejudice never became as dominant as it did in places like India or later in Europe. So we see that, according to Mr. Rodgers' research, that India and Egypt, the populaces there demonstrated some form of color prejudice. There was some form of hierarchy or caste system that was created that was due in part to the color of the skin, whether it be darker or lighter or vice versa. And we see those same institutions erected and operating till to this day. A lot of people, whether knowingly or not, really fall into the ploy of these systems that uses these markers to separate the people, to keep everybody wedged against one another, to keep the idea of lighter is better and darker is worse and vice versa in the minds and the hearts of the people, to our very detriment, because while we concentrate on these low vibrational ideologies, the powers that be are moving forward with plans that they're enacting against all of us that fall into this pool of lighter and darker complexion to their betterment and to our detriment. Once we realize this, we'll be better off as a people as a whole. So, point number 3 of the history of prejudice origins goes to the rabbinic writings. Another interesting find documented by J.A. Rodgers deal with the rabbis and their seemingly controversial writings. And I quote, "The third instance of color prejudice is to be found in the rabbinical writings. The early rabbis did very definitively and abundantly say that a black skin was the result of a curse on Ham by Noah. The signs of this curse, said certain rabbis, were a black skin, misshapen lips, and twisted hair. The Bible says the curse was placed on Canaan, Ham's son, but some rabbis say it was placed directly on Ham. Rabbi Huya said that he came forth from the ark black-skinned. This would mean that Ham, who had gone into the ark fair-skinned, had undergone this change of color in the only 190 days that had been in the ark. Ham, it appears, had been guilty of some sexual infraction while in there from having intercourse with his wife to sodomy. Topinard, French anthropologist, thinks too that the rabbis of the first century were the first to stress differences of race and color. Race as we now use it, he says, was unknown in far antiquity, at least in the West. He correctly notes that Aristotle, father of natural history, and Hippocrates, father of medicine, do not mention race, though both study anatomy and the then known varieties of the human race, including the Negro. The Greek had two distinct divisions of humanity, Greek and barbarian, or citizen and alien. An Athenian who married an alien, regardless of color, was sold into slavery. It was for a long time the same in Rome. Race as based on color and physique is, in fact, comparatively recent. The King James Bible of the 17th century does not mention it. Shakespeare used it only for family lineages or contests. So also do the first English dictionary by Nathaniel Bailey in 1736 and the second by Dr. Samuel Johnson in 1750. To quote Topinard, in the first century when Christianity was beginning to seed itself in Rome, the doctrine of a separate creation for whites and blacks was defended by the Babylonian rabbis and later by Emperor Julian. In 415 AD, when one council was debating whether the Ethiopians were descended from Adam and the theory they weren't was making progress, St. Augustine in his City of God intervened and declared that no Christian would doubt that all men, of no matter what form, color, or height, were of the same protoplasmic origin. Emperor Julian the Apostate said on race, for different natures must have existed in all those things that among the nations were to be differentiated. Thus, at any rate is seen, if one observes how very different in their bodies are the Germans and Scythians from the Libyans and Ethiopians. The first were whites, the latter two blacks. The charge of rabbinic racism rests upon a total of 5 statements. 2 of these occur in the early Talmudic Midrashic corpus. The others are in later medieval sources, and view dark skin as a curse of God. God prohibited Noah and all the creatures in the ark from engaging in sex during the flood. I have decided to destroy my world, and you would create life. 3 creatures transgressed, the dog, the raven, and Ham, son of Noah, and were punished. Ham's punishment was that he became black, a procreative, i.e. genetic punishment for a procreative sin. And this is out of the book by David Goldenberg, The Curse of Ham, A Curse of Rabbinic Racism, page 7. Very interesting that in the early writings of the rabbis that they would insinuate that black skin was a curse of Ham. But when you read in the scriptures, Ham was never cursed. It was the son Canaan that was cursed by his grandfather Noah. So for them to even try to make that correlation, you see that they're in error. And then you will have to then examine the rest of those writings to contend how accurate they are. And you will probably find a lot of inaccuracies and misconceptions within those writings. I've never read them, so I can't holistically tell you if they do contain that or not. Point number 4 of History of Prejudice Origins deals with Rome. Now this leads us to the next recorded event in history that points to color racism as recorded by J.A. Rodgers, which is the Roman Empire. He states, "The 4th stage in the development of color prejudices seemed therefore to have occurred in Rome of the 1st century AD, as a phase of the fight between Christianity and paganism. Prior to that, however, pagan masters held the belief that humanity, regardless of color, were either Roman or barbarian." Sounds like the statement that was made earlier. Christianity, the new religion, decided that of one blood God made all the peoples of the earth, and that all men were brothers in Christ. Moreover, the earliest Christians pictured the Virgin Mary and Christ as black, both being an evolution of the worship of Isis and Horus, which was once common in Rome. Point 5, dealing with history of prejudice origins. We now focus on Europe and America. Let's fast forward to the early American settlers who set up colonies here in the Americas. This is the stage of racism that modern society is familiar with since its establishment on these shores roughly 5 to 6 generations ago. This is what Mr. Rodgers has to say about the 5th stage of color prejudice. This began the 5th and present stage of color prejudice. And since it was a time when it was considered most awful, not to everything, the colonists picked up the story of Ham, tacked on the obscure Jewish legends already mentioned, and used them as God's own orders to enslave the blacks. The legend of the Gibeonites, doomed by Joshua to be hewers of wood and drawers of water, was also woven in. Differences of color, hair, and features were pushed to extreme length, as in Hinton Rowan Helper's Najoke, published in 1867, where even the color of buildings were reduced to prove the inferiority of the black skin. Of course, the motive was production of tobacco, cotton, and sugar. This doctrine of Negro inferiority was supported by several European thinkers, among them the great Voltaire. In reply, the belief held by some that the white man was descended from the black, he said that only a blind man was permitted to believe such nonsense. Man, it's crazy because they gotta be rolling in their grave right now because science and anthropology has said that all men and women have descended from a melanated man in antiquity. So for that to be brought out now compared to the ancient writings or the earlier writings, I know some of these authors in their prejudice and racist mind has to be rolling over in their graves at this moment with their descendants bringing forth the information and the knowledge and to a large degree, some truth as to the origin of man on this planet and what their phenotypical appearance looked like. The round eyes of the Negroes, he said, their flat noses, thick lips, ears of different shape, the wool on their heads, the measure of their intelligence, placed between them and the other species prodigious differences. And that was page 19 through 20. So as we see, according to Mr. J.A. Rodgers, that color prejudice in its earliest forms was somewhat implemented amongst civilizations that were melanated. It wasn't the same as we have grown to know it today. It wasn't based on fair white skin versus brown to dark skin as we have it today. Though you do see in his writings that there was some level of a hierarchy that was created to lighter skinned melanated people versus darker skinned melanated people. There's probably no way around this. And a lot of that goes into just, the covetousness of man in the corporeal state that we're in. That's just one of the sins of the flesh. But it was never implemented to the degree that we have come to know it today. That's been administered by predominantly European factions, or what is known today as the Caucasian race, upon the indigenous and Afrocentric populace of the world. And a lot of these things was implemented through the writings of the rabbis, with their insinuation that all black people or all melanated people were cursed by Noah due to some alleged sexual immorality that took place upon the ark, which we know is full of nonsense. They cannot corroborate that. They have nothing to substantiate that. It's really just a viewpoint that was placed in these writings to hinder the acknowledgement and the truth of who the Creator's chosen people are and what they look like. And this is why it's very profound to understand what the chosen people and the people of antiquity looked like when we bring out this information about their skin tone and their phenotypes, because it's been for the most part whitewashed through history. And it's not to degrade any other nation or civilization of people, but it's only brought forth to bring the truth and highlight the truth and the lies and deceit that's been placed throughout history upon a people, and an understanding and a knowledge that has been hid from all civilizations on this earth for the most part. So never take it in an offensive way when you hear people talk about the melanization of the ancient man and woman. All that is transpiring is truth being brought forth onto the earth to dispel the lies and the deceit that's been taught in these schools of miseducation. So let's just recap on the author's thoughts about prejudice as a social tool and how it kind of aligns with society throughout the different points of history. Rodgers points out that one huge factor in color prejudice is power, right? When European nations started expanding into Asia, Africa, and the Americas, color difference became a tool to justify their dominance and exploit their regions. They used color to set up social hierarchies, and this is where the concept of race starts to look a lot like it does today. Prejudice became a necessary tool for keeping certain people down while elevating others. And this is what I'm talking about. It's a tool used to put people in places of power, positions of power, and to keep other people under the heels, the boot heels of these people that have placed themselves in power. It's also used as a segregation tool to keep the masses battling amongst one another, so that way you're not focused on the real plot that's being placed against you, and you're no longer a threat or a hindrance to these people who are now placed themselves in power. Rodgers' key point is that all these ideas of color superiority aren't natural or permanent. He believes people in power kept them alive to maintain control. And interestingly, he finds examples from the 1800s of white British people showing almost no prejudice towards darker skinned people until they went to colonies like West Africa, where color-based hierarchies were pushed to extremes. And there's a lot of information on West Africa and who the inhabitants were in these regions and where they came from and why they were there. What was the purposes behind them being there? You got to do a lot of research on that, but there's videos out there, but there's a lot of history that's not told to us as to the populace within Western Africa, how they got there, what their purpose was for being there, and what happened to them when colonization took place here in the Americas. Prejudice, as Rodgers sees it, is like a plant. It only grows if it's zealously tended. This is just scratching the surface of Rodgers' research, but it's clear that he challenges a lot of assumptions about race and color prejudice. And that's what we have to do as a people. We have to challenge a lot of ideas, a lot of ideologies, a lot of information that we come across, because it's a strong possibility that you've been led astray or miseducated. That's why it's very important to not only read, but to also compare texts, to look into history, compare writings from other civilizations, and see what they say about certain things. And you also have to, operate within the spirit to lead and guide you to truth. Because a lot of times with all the information explosion that's happening, you're getting a lot of truth in this information, but you're also getting a lot of untruth mixed in with it. And so now it becomes hard to differentiate between the two. So with that being said, another powerful piece of information from the late great J.A. Rodgers, one of our esteemed elders, researchers, and authors within our community, who was diligently seeking out truth and information so that way he could put it in the hands of his people to not only educate his people, but to elevate and enlighten them at the same time. If you want to hear a lot more about his insights and how they fit in today's world, tune in to more on the Fire Talk Radio podcast, where we'll be discussing it in all its depth, all its lore, and all its truths. And with that being said, thanks for watching. Once again, don't forget to like, share, and definitely subscribe to the channel. Plus, hit the bell for more deep dives into the books and thoughts that we bring forth on this channel, especially for the Illuminated Mind series. With that being said, I appreciate everybody that tuned in to today's episode. And once again, if it's the Most High will, we'll be bringing out even more information, more books to highlight, and more things to enlighten our people with. So with that being said, shalom, and have a good day, everybody. And tune in again to Fire Talk Radio podcast with your host, Don Yehuda.